Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Welcome to the first program in our new series, Meet the Author. I'm your host, Gillian Leonard. On today's program, I'll be talking to Ari Kane-DeMaios. Ari is a national expert on transgender issues and co-edited the book, Crossing Sexual Boundaries, Transgender Journeys, Uncharted Paths. I hope you enjoy the program. Okay. My name is Gillian, and today we have Ari Kane-DeMaios, who has co-edited the book, Crossing Sexual Boundaries, Transgender Journeys, Uncharted Paths. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Before we discuss the book, I thought it might be useful for our audience if you could define the term transgender, because I think it's a pretty big term and encompasses quite a lot of things.
It does. It's an umbrella term, and it's one that's used in conjunction with folks who want to cross either a gender boundary, a sexual boundary, or a combination of boundaries. And that's why it's generally labeled transgender, and the gender word is also mixed in with the sex word. So I like to use the word trans community as opposed to transgender community, because trans means crossing from the Latin, and what it does gives people a better idea that what we're doing is crossing some social, economic, or psyche boundaries. So that's why the term is used. And while I didn't choose that particular term, I wanted to make sure it was different from somebody who was a transsexual, as well as somebody who was just a, say, a closet or an open cross-dresser. Mm-hmm. And the categories go for both males and females.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tell us about the purpose of the book and who you hope that it reaches, or who you hope reads this book. Also, how it came about, who thought of it, and how you approached the people who contributed their stories for it.
Well, that's 2 hours. Well, in the nutshell, the book was a brainchild of my co-author, Vern Bullock, who asked me to get involved with having a written record of people who've led some of these journeys, and either were too bashful, did not have time, or were very conservative about wanting to share their journeys with other people. This was in 2002. Vern and I go back at least 15 years in professional meetings. And in 2002, he said, Ari, I think it might be nice to do a book about the gender journeys of people who have not been so well publicized, like Christine Jorgensen and I'm trying to think of some of the other ones, but anyway, that ilk, someone who got a lot of public notoriety. And the function here was to guide healthcare professionals into understanding that gender is not just something in putting on the garments of the other gender, but basically to give vent to some deep and emotional questions about gender role and gender perception, which is nobody's territory except that of a human being. There are a lot of sex roles out there, but there are really unique gender roles. And while we get all herded into one of two gender options in this culture, make no mistake, there's a whole plethora of those gender options. And they will unfold over the decades of a person's life. So, with all that being said, Vern thought it was a great idea for us to look for people who have reached at least the fifth or sixth decade of their lives, that's in the 40s to 60 range, and ask if they would be willing to write an autobiography focusing on their gender development, and also to give some insight by decade, which is really one of the unique features of this particular book, of how your gender had grown and developed and stayed with you right up until the time that you were writing this. And that's what happened. I provided a lot of the potential contributors and he and I both edited the work, and then he contributed some aspects of the introduction, and I did most of the work on the appendices, which are equally important in this book. And apart from the 20 or so autobiographies, the introduction gives the reader some insight into recent gender history about how people thought about gender prior to Christine Jorgensen and then after Christine Jorgensen, and what that meant for people who were at that time in gender conflict. The gender conflict was a term really created by psychiatrists who thought that there were only two genders and everything else was sort of anomalous or psychotic or neurotic or whatever. And those were not necessarily the correct medical diagnoses at that time, but they stuck. So one of the issues was, if I really feel like a woman, I should have the biology that reflects that. And part of that has to do with changing bottom surgery from having a penis to creating a vagina. And top surgery, if you didn't have breasts of your own by hormone development, you could have implants. And in the 60s and 70s, there were very few people in America who were doing this kind of work. And so one of the issues was, who could we ask who might be willing to do the surgeries, because they thought the surgery was bordering on psychotic behavior in the medical profession. So with the proper safeguards, they finally developed a protocol, and we were able to attract a couple of surgeons. And Verne outlines that in his part of the introduction. The other part was parallel to the development of the transsexual phenomena. There was also development of cross-dresser organizations. And they started with a person whose name is Virginia Prince. And in the 60s, she was the first to create an organization where a lot of people who cross-dressed but lived in closets were around. And so in Southern California is where she started her first group, and it mushroomed into national, international groups. And there is a strong remnant of that early work in an organization known as, I think, the Tri-S organization, which is the initials for the Society for the Second Self. And what it does is gives people a way in which they can meet and socialize, and a lot of them are married in the conventional way and have spouses who don't understand this and may be tolerant once they understood it. So those were two major developments, and we need to be sure that we don't lose sight of those in the historical record. So Verne was very careful about writing about that part. My concerns happened after 1990. While I was active in the 70s and 80s, it's in the 90s that we began to see a real shift. And that was when some of the social thinkers, and particularly someone, names of which may be well known or not, one was, trying to think of the names now. I'm blocking on the names, can you believe it? Well, one was Marjorie Garber, and she wrote a book about cross-dressing and social anxiety, cultural anxiety she called it. And it was a very well-written book about the history of people who did cross-dress, both males and females. The second development was the the discovery of a book by Magnus Hirschfeld, who was in the early part of the 20th century the father of what we call modern sexology. And he wrote a book about the erotic desire to cross-dress, and in German, of course. And during the rise of the Nazi regime, they destroyed most of his work, and including a lot of these books. However, a few of them escaped into England with some former students, and they were not discovered until about 1985 or 86. One of them was this book, The Erotic Desire to Cross-Dress. And in it were 17 case studies that Dr. Hirschfeld had documented, so that the phenomenon was not new. It was well known into the 20th century, but we didn't really have the insights of Dr. Hirschfeld's work. But in 1990, my colleague, Vern Bullock, found a good translator from the German into English, and we got the book translated and published, and it's become one of the hallmarks of the whole trans population. People need to know that, and that book is available, and people should, if they really want to know something about what some of the lifestyles were then, they can read and access that book. There were other people as well, and one of them was a woman named Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn at that time was a graduate student in anthropology. And she studied the work of a man named Van Gennep, who was a French, Dutch sociologist. At that time, everybody was in philosophy. There was no sociology department or psychology departments or any of that sort of thing. And so in studying Van Gennep, he talked about the rites of passage over the lifespan. And she drew the analogy that a lot of people who gender shift have to go through rites of passage in order to be fully expressive in their preferred gender role. And it was the subject of her thesis, and out of it came a book called In Search of Eve, which documents the transsexual journeys of several of the people that she had interviewed. The last person that's very important was someone named Sandra Bem. And Sandra's work was to really begin to analyze the nature of how gender is formed in our culture. Not necessarily by some hocus pocus, but a lot of the factors that make up our lives. And basically they were the existential viewpoint, which says that, you know, you were born a male or a female, and therefore you're automatically conveyed or conferred a gender status, either being masculine or feminine. While that may be generally true, in actual fact everybody are mixtures of both genders. And then the social development is where you begin to see the differentiation. So Sandra's work and Marjorie Garber's work, or things we wanted to make sure the readership was aware of, and it's a good bibliography in the book as well. The other two pieces, and I'll just end by that, and maybe the listening audience can read those things. We thought it was important that people know the nature of how the surgeries are done for people who opt for congruence between their gender preference and expression and their biology. If they were born with a biology that was more male and female, and they wanted to be female, there's a procedure for that. And it's not as clear-cut as people would like to think, you know, just cut it off and then wrap it around something. And more difficult, of course, was the female who wanted to become male. And the development of a neophallus is still in experimental stages. But at least the removal of a lot of the female anatomy that goes with reproduction could be taken care of and give the female to male man a chance to be more masculine. So those are included, and then I created a thing called isostasy models. These are equilibrium models of how gender can be looked at and understood in a present or past context. And so there's a whole appendix on that. And we end up with a bibliography and a glossary, so that people who don't know what trans X might be could find that out by looking at the back of the book.
Okay. You founded Fantasia Fair, and perhaps you could talk about that a little bit, what the original years were like and how it's changed over the years.
It's a very good question. Yes, in 1974, I took on the leadership of trying to educate people who wanted to know more about cross-dressing and cross-gender behaviors. Being a student of this myself and self-taught as well as experienced, I thought it might be a good idea to have a kind of a fair so that people could learn some of the aspects of how you gender shift, what kind of presentations one looks for, and a chance to explore what's like living in this role, at least for 2 days or 3 days, up to a week, in a tolerant, open community. All revolutionary, by the way. It's one thing to be on the stage as a femme impressionist or a female impersonator, but it's another thing to go out in public and look fashionable without looking like a clown. And all of this was new for most of us who came. And in 1975, we put together a program and we marketed it, and there was a lot of wonderful, at that time not so wonderful, stories that one could tell about whether this was going to ever work or not. In a nutshell, 40 people braved the elements to come to Provincetown, Massachusetts in October, and we had the first Fantasia Fair. It was filled with events that are inimitable, one of a kind, and it's still going. So we must have done something right in Fantasia Fair 1 to have 31 others follow it
A lot of people
consecutively.
speak very positively about it, people who've attended. So it's very touching, some of the stories, that people really feel that they're sort of comfortable for the first time in that situation.
Yeah, well, we like to think that we've pushed back some frontier of ignorance, particularly with the cross-dressers who think that they were born in the wrong body, and they may not have been born in the wrong body. They just want to express some things that are usually not expressible in the conventions of American culture today. One of the wonderful things about this was we had a real plethora of people who came from very diverse backgrounds. One was a priest, another was a high mucky-muck from General Electric. We didn't ask all these questions, they volunteered these questions. One person was somebody, and they came from different parts of the country, because while we were in the Northeast, getting the word out, and this is very interesting, when the grapevine, no computers in those days, none of those devices that we use. It was word of mouth, and if you had access to one of the underground journals that were available, we advertised in that, and we got people from California, and people from the Midwest, and some people from the Northeast, obviously. And the marketing was kind of a unique experience, but one event I should probably share with the audience. One of the people was coming from Seattle, Washington. And we knew nothing about her except she wrote glowingly this was her dream to end all dreams, and she couldn't wait to get there, and so forth and so on. And I didn't know how she was coming to the Northeast, or getting to Provincetown, mind you. So she took a bus. And instead of traveling through the northern fork or the northern tier of the United States, she traveled via Canada. And she arrived 24 hours before the fair was to begin. Now, I should also preface my remarks by saying that 3 weeks prior to the fair, the place where we were going to hold our activities went into receivership. So it was padlocked, and we didn't have a place to do the thing. So here we had 40 some odd people coming to this thing, not knowing that this was happening, and we had to connect with all those people. In those days, no fax machines, no certainly cell phones or anything like that. And even the public telephone was difficult because these people were afraid that giving out their private phone number would be tantamount to creating chaos. So we managed to get hold of a good 3/4 of the people, but this person came the day before to the designated place that was in the brochure. It was padlocked. We could do nothing to let her know. And we wondered why she didn't attend until the last day of that fair. She had sent me a letter, registered letter, saying she was appalled at the fact that you let her down, and we let her down, that she came and she couldn't find anybody, and I had no idea how she came. I didn't know if she asked anybody. You'd think somebody who travels 4,000 miles might ask somebody, but she didn't, and we were just terribly heartbroken that she didn't enjoy the week as it was. We offered her a free fare for the following year if there was going to be a free fare, and that's the last we heard of her.
Oh.
It was kind of a sad, but it's significant note that doesn't happen now. I mean, between internet, chat rooms, I mean, the communications media are all around.
Well, there's a
us.
very nice website for it.
It is. I must say that, and no thanks
Like
to me, because I'm not a computer wizard on this, but it does really give you a good overview of Fantasia Fair in the new millennium here. So, and interestingly enough, out of that spawned a lot of my work in sexology. The fair for me was a very good experience because I was able to both teach and apply some of the things that I had learned from my colleagues in the sexology world, and then return that by doing papers at national meetings. So that's how I met Vern Bullock and a lot of the other professional people in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, let's see. Transgender people are still marginalized in the society in spite of much more media attention to gay and lesbian issues. Can you comment on that at all? Why
Yeah, I can
that
comment
is,
on
or-
some of it, yeah, not all of it.
Yeah.
Part of it's the nature of the transgender community. Most people who know somebody in one gender role or another do not anticipate they're going to see somebody in an alternative gender presentation. Maybe at Halloween, perhaps at New Year's Eve, certainly other occasions where you can dress up and play whoever you wanted to play. But if you do this without prior warning, and you just enter one day to an Elks meeting dressed as Miss Hoffenpfeffer, they will boot you out very quickly. And of
Right.
course, not only does that create ill will about who the person was, even though the person was an Elk member, it creates kind of a schism in how we communicate generally. Most people, if they have gender issues in their lives, don't vent them in public. When they do, they create more problems because the public is not expecting this. Not that the public has to be anticipating this, but if you're going to a setting where there are more people who don't know who you are and they will feel uncomfortable about your presence in a gender role that's good for you and maybe one or two other people, but not for the majority of that event, it's socially propitious not to involve other people with it. On the other hand, if you're very serious about this and you want to tell the people that are nearest and dearest to you about this, there is a protocol that we have developed that works, and people have to learn it and also abide by it with variations. This doesn't happen very often, and the media pick up on all the negative ones. So that creates a negative experience for the non-cross-dresser or trans person. The second is the behavior modes. There are behavior modes that never become apparent until all of a sudden they are acted upon, and one of those is public restrooms. In the public restroom, males have one place to go and females have another place to go. And if you are in a public place and you need to go to the bathroom and you're dressed in a gender role or a gender presentation that usually is not typical of your own, you need to be propitious about when you do that and how you do that. There are some places where that is not acceptable behavior, and you have to be careful about those places. But if you do this and you scare some women in a ladies' room about a man in the room who's wearing a dress, the law enforcement will come down and will use all kinds of reasons to arrest you and perhaps make a scene about it. Usually it's misdemeanor. But the scare of this creates all kinds of gender problems in the public domain. In the privacy of your own residence, I mean, whatever works for you and your partner, if there's a partner. That is what you follow. In general, if you had to use a restroom and you were, say, a female to male, and you want to take advantage of the urinals, which is a big thing for a lot of F to M people, they've developed a technique whereby you can do this without getting all messed up, without having to go into the stall where there are men's bathrooms have stalls as well. But in women's bathrooms, there are no urinals per se. So the propitious thing to do is to do what most ladies do if they do what they do, and then get out. One of the things that I've noticed about ladies' rooms in this culture, especially the better heeled ones, is they're a place for a woman who's having a menstrual period to find a little place to sit and deal with the cramps and whatever. That is not available in men's rooms. Not that men need to do this. I see we're getting close to that
I
moment
think we
of
are
truth.
getting close to the end. We should think about what would you like to say about this book? The one thing that you'd like people to understand. I don't know if I want to wrap things up with this. This is a big topic to understand about transgendered people. If you had one thing that you'd like the book to get across to people after they've read it.
Well, I put down practice random acts of tolerance and kindness. That's sort of in a nutshell. You know,
Okay.
the golden rule always works well. But there are some other things that I think that might bear for if we have a minute or so. I think that gender expression is the major way in which most people communicate, socially, psychically, and economically. And it's the main connection between males and females. In a culture that has lots of dress codes and everything else, that's what we are saddled with. If we were in an Aboriginal culture, this would not be the case. It's very clear what biology's role is, what social propriety is, and so forth. I would like to see most people understand some of the differences and similarities between individuals. Now, whether they're gender shifters or typical normative men and women. To be more sincere in your assessment of the lifestyle of a trans person. In other words, well, you look like a wreck of the Hesperus, but you've got a good heart. And you do good works when you go to the hospital and take care of people who are more indigent than you are, and so forth and so on. So being a little more introspective and considerate of the inner person. And the last, I would not be abashed if I was a friend of a cross-gender person or trans person to ask some serious questions about what makes this doable for you and not doable for me. They may not answer why it's not doable for that person, but they certainly may get some insights about why the person has done it. All of this has been part of a program that we've run throughout the country called the Educational Institute for Sex and Gender Diversity. It is currently located in Latham, New York, our offices and our address, and we have an email and so forth. And for people who'd like to know more about this or find out more about details of the book, we have an address, and that can be available either at Sanford or wherever.
Great. Ari, thank you very much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
Well, my pleasure.
Thanks.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.